Okay, hi everyone, welcome to this event. It's the fourth event of our events fortnight, and as you guys can see, but it's called Should I Cancel God? And this is, so just to introduce everything first, I'm Miriam, as you guys probably know. I'll be hosting this event, and this is Claire, our speaker. So Claire is the founder of Get Real, which is an Christian apologetics organization which addresses questions about Christianity and also the intersection with racial justice as well, particularly from the Black British community, which, as we've seen from recent news, is something that's very, very much needed in today's society. She has a degree of English language and literature from Oxford, and then she trained in theology at Wycliffe Hall, and she has a master's in leadership and also in culture, Diaspora, and ethnicity. And she's currently doing her PhD on theology. She's interested in activism, apologetics, and enjoys engaging with questions of culture, truth, identity, and the gospel. So Claire, thank you so much for coming today. And just to give everyone a format of the event in case you haven't been to one. So what we're going to do is, after this introduction that I've just given, Claire and I are going to have a conversation of about 20 to 25 minutes. And then we'll give everyone a 5-minute break just to get some snacks and drinks, go to the washroom. And after that, we'll have a Q&A session where you guys can submit questions on the Slido. So you guys can just go into Slido and then type that code throughout the event if anything interesting comes up. And you guys can also vote on which questions you want to be answered. And we'll try our best to get to them at the end of the event. So let's get to it then. So Claire, again, thank you for coming. Just so we have a little bit idea of who you are, could you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, your faith journey, and or anything you just want to share would be
great. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be with you. Yeah, great journey, really simple route down here. But so yeah, I am a Christian. As I said, as Miriam said, I run an organization called Get Real, which looks at questions of faith, questions and objections to the Christian faith, but particularly from the Black British community. And so I was growing up in a Christian home, and I was in church a lot. My dad was a preacher. But as I was kind of in my 20s, I was starting to have some doubts and some questions about what it is I believe, why I'm doing this, does it make sense? Is it worth it? And so I started to become interested in apologetics, which is basically looking at the reasoned defense of the Christian faith. There's a scripture that says, always be ready to give an answer for what it is that you believe, but do so with gentleness and respect. So getting into apologetics and looking at the cumulative case for Christianity, why I believe that it is true, was really helpful to strengthen my faith as well.
Yeah, so thank you for that. And I think so many of us who've grown up in churches can definitely relate to the part, or even just any Christians in general, about doubting and having questions. And actually, we're told that that's a good thing. So you, aside from being like an apologist, you're also an educator. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Budding apologist, I had to say. But in terms of education, yes. So I was an English teacher in South East London for 10 years. Just 10 years of my life. But no, I did enjoy it. I really did enjoy it. So yeah, I taught English literature. In my last post in education, I was an assistant head teacher as well. And I do some visiting lecturing at university now as well.
Great. It's all right, no worries. Okay, so let's get to kind of the title of the event then. So obviously we're talking about cancel culture. Cancel culture, if you guys don't know, is something that's really pertinent, especially on the internet. And what it typically involves is someone who's high profile, or maybe an organization even, or just anyone on the internet saying or doing something that other people find contentious and they disagree with. And what they do after that is they proceed to cancel them. And there are many avenues in which people do this. Like boycotts, unfollowing people, slander. There's lots that I probably can't even get to. But I guess to begin this conversation, why do you think humans feel the need to cancel one another? Obviously there's themes of justice there, but what do you think are the core motivations of cancel culture and why it arose in the first place?
Yeah, I think cancel culture has similarities actually to the gospel, the Christian message, in that it says that you have done something wrong, you have offended people, your actions are, aren't what we expect. Therefore, there should be consequences for those actions. And so I think people come from, as you mentioned, come to the cancel culture question from a position of justice. They are outraged, and moral outrage is a good thing. When you see someone, if a member of your family, or if you see someone being hurt, being treated badly, and your reaction is, oh, okay, that's really interesting, then that's not love, is it? That's indifference. But actually, when we are morally outraged by things, and then as a culture we're shifting to cancel culture, it's actually telling us that there is an element of love there, because injustice requires an angry reaction. Okay, that motivates you to act. But in terms of the end result of cancel culture, you should have some questions about that.
Great. So this is about canceling, like humans canceling other humans. And again, there's so many avenues in which people do that. What about the precise title of this event then? Why do you think, aside from canceling humans, like humans also feel the need to cancel God? Is this because the church has done more harm than good? Or what are, again, like, is there history attached to this that we should understand? And should we be acknowledging that, or how should we respond?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that I would say three things in brief. The first would be the kind of intellectual questions that people have. So science versus God, for instance, and I hope that you've already seen that there's not much of a conflict in that. But the idea that science gives us the answers, we don't need God. We're making strides in our, AI and technology. We don't need, to invoke the divine. So, and then there's also the existential questions. So, what about my suffering? What about justice? What about my purpose? Do I need to invoke God to answer those questions? And then I think the third thing would be the fact that we're still currently post-pandemic, which has been a watershed moment for people. Once you've had to come off the treadmill of life of, working really hard at university, and you've had to stop, you've been forced to stop, life's deepest questions rise to the surface. And so I think that people in the middle of their suffering and bereavement, so many people have lost people in this pandemic, might be saying, well, if there is a God, why has all this happened? So I think the pandemic has been a massive, as I said, watershed moment, deep existential questions of life, and also intellectual questions that don't seem to be compatible with the idea of God.
I think that's really insightful, and definitely something that all of us as Christians and non-Christians can definitely see in our day-to-day lives as well. So I guess moving a little bit away from the motivations of why we want to cancel God, I guess the next question that arises from that is whether we have the right to cancel God, because, well, if God is the one who created the earth and created us, do we have the right to cancel God?
Ooh. I think as well, you'd have to, which God are you cancelling here? Who do you mean by God? What do you mean by God? Because people bring many definitions to the idea of God. But if we're talking about the God of the Bible, who has made himself known expressly in the person of Jesus, then one of the things about the Christian faith that I find compelling is the notion of free will, that, I can choose or I can refuse God, and that's my choice. So do we have the right? I think I would pose it more as you have the option to live your life without God, but actually does the world make more sense to include him in it? And I think there's some things about our longing for justice that actually point us to the existence of God rather than away from him.
That's really, again, very insightful and something that we can definitely all reflect on. So I guess moving back to the intentions, do you think, obviously it comes from a place of love and justice, as you've established, but do you think cancel culture in general helps us achieve our goals?
Yeah, I think cancel culture too, in terms of the motivation for it, I think there's something that I can definitely affirm, the idea of moral outrage and wanting to act. But actually the end result of it is very different to what the Christian message is, which is that you are finished. okay, you are gone. There's no redemption for you. There's no mercy. There's no second chances. And actually, cancel culture highlights, I think, not only our sense for wanting justice and our moral outrage, which is a good thing, but also what happens when the finger of justice is pointing at us. So I was on Instagram the other day and I saw a celebrity and they're, very well known for making sort of pithy statements and just an engaging person to follow. And they said words to the effect of, if you're in a position of power and you don't use your power to help people without that power, if you don't use your power for good, essentially, then you no longer have the right to be called a good person. Okay? If you don't use your power for good, if you're in a position of power, then you've lost all rights to be called a good person. It doesn't apply to you. And I think on the surface, you would possibly agree with that, if you're in a position of power, you should try to help people wherever you can. But then I just thought, could that celebrity endure that judgment that they are given? If it would just take a little rifle through the archives of that celebrity's social media, where they were in a position of power to help somebody and they didn't, and then they would have to accept what they've just said. And so there's this tension in cancel culture, rightly being morally outraged to say we want justice here, but then also what do you do with the injustice of your own heart? Okay, that the things that we do that don't measure up, and then when that same finger of cancel culture is pointing at us, can we endure that judgment? We want grace, we want a second chance, we want mercy. And so I think this is where the Christian message differs in saying, yeah, you're a mess. You make mistakes, and yet your anger is justified when you see wrong, but you're also a mess. And actually, we see that those two things being met at the cross, met in the person of Jesus.
That's wonderful. And I think, as we know, like the cross is the ultimate sacrifice that God paid for us. And following onto that, like I just want to pick up on a point you mentioned about positions of power and also cancel culture. Why do you think we place so much emphasis on positions of earthly power? Like, why do we feel like it's particularly that people with positions of power on earth that we want to cancel, as opposed to like just ordinary individuals, even though like that happens as well?
Yeah, I just think there's a general sense that, if you've been given much, if you've acquired much, then much is expected of you. And also there's a whole critique, any social scientist here, about, those who are powerful, those who are wealthy. How did you acquire such wealth? Was it done ethically? Looking at those questions. And when people start to kind of pick holes in that, then it's almost like, you have the people pointing a finger of justice at you. So I think that there is a sense within us to want to help oppressed and marginalized voices. And that is a good thing. And I think that comes from the fact that we're made in the image of God, that when I see someone suffering, something in me is moved, because it's when injustice is done to a person, it's an affront to God himself as well as my own moral outrage. But I think, when you have a lot, people expect more from you. So yeah.
Great. Do you think this is kind of the same way in which people view cancel culture and the church? Because historically, we can't deny that as an institution, the church has done a lot of harm. Mm-hmm. And there are many examples of which we can list. Do you think as the church, we should be acknowledging that? How do we respond? Mm-hmm. Do we just dismiss it, throw it under the rug and just preach forgiveness? Like, what is it that we should do?
Yeah, and that is one of the big critiques that the church has come under, in terms of not pointing out where the church has made mistakes, okay, and being repentant about it and saying, look, holding our hands up, we've got this wrong here. That's been a huge critique with many things. I'm not going to name them all, but that have happened recently and also in the past. And I think there's something powerful about the church, or as a Christian, if I'm in a conversation with someone who's really rightly upset about the record of the church, to say sorry, to own that. If I'm claiming to be a Christian, then I need to own the baggage that comes with that. But what I also want to do is to separate the failures of myself and the institution of the church, of Christendom, the failures of Christendom, and also the truth and the beauty and the satisfaction of the person of Jesus Christ. And I think they're two separate things. And actually, the failures of the church just go on to show us that actually we're all desperately in need of a savior. You can't do it on your own. Yeah, I think acknowledging the past, and that's one thing that's really important to me regarding racial justice, is a huge thing. But also making that distinction. And just to add this, there's a famous abolitionist called Frederick Douglass, and he wrote his slave narrative, talking about what he endured as a slave on a plantation. And in the appendix, he writes and says, look, looking at what I've written here, because he doesn't pull any punches, he vividly describes what went on plantations and in the name of the church, okay? And he says, it looks like I'm against Christianity, but what he says is between the plantation and the slave cradle plundering, woman whipping, slavery of this land, between that form of Christianity and Christ, I see the widest possible difference. And so the fact that someone who had endured what he had endured can still find that there's something compelling about Jesus, I think is very significant.
I particularly like the point, and it's particularly striking what you mentioned about separating the institution of a church and Jesus himself, because those are two very different things. But obviously, as the institution in society, that's what represents God. And so I guess especially for the non-believers, that would be more of a direct link. But as believers, we know this is something we should be separating. But yeah, I definitely really resonate with what you said about just having to acknowledge where our wrongdoings, because all of us are doing wrongs and we're not perfect. So this leads us, I guess, to the next question, which is, did God cancel us at all? And well, yeah, we'll just go with that. We'll just start with it.
Did God cancel us? Well, the message of Christianity is that God loves us, and that when he looks at the tension that we have in our heart, the idea that we want justice, but also we're not able to even meet the very standards of justice that we're doling out to others, the brokenness of our heart, which Christians will sin. God has intervened and said, look, I'm not cancelling you. Yes, you're a mess, but you have inestimable worth. Though it's just an amazing thing that it's the human condition. And we see that in Jesus. And ultimately he sacrificed on the cross, that those two things were met. And so no, God hasn't cancelled us at all. And he hasn't imposed himself upon us. As I said it before, he's given us free will to choose or refuse him, but the option to not only be in right relationship with him, but flowing out of that, we're in right relationship with others as well.
I think that's really comforting to hear, because obviously all of us carry some sort of burden, shame, or just this feeling that we've done so much wrong. And how can we how do we even draw close to God when we feel so distant? But it's a reminder that God gives us his grace, and it's freely given, and all we have to do is kind of just embrace that with open arms. So I guess going more into that, could you give us like a few examples maybe of what happens during Jesus's life, examples of how he didn't cancel us, and how actually he's always really close to the vulnerable and the weak, and also sinners, and he's, for instance, with tax collectors, he's always just near them and inviting them to meet.
Yeah, I think my most compelling story of the life of Jesus is in St. John 4, where he meets this woman at the well, and she's shunned by her society. He's not meant to be talking to her because of ethnic differences, religious differences, gender differences, every kind of conflict you can imagine. Jesus was not meant to be talking to her, but he did. So much so that when his followers, his disciples came back and saw this conversation going on, they were shocked, but none of them had the guts to say. So just that conversation and that interaction. And then when Jesus challenged her about her lifestyle choices, okay, he didn't cancel her because of it. Her society, her fellow Samaritan society, had cancelled this woman to the point where she was collecting water, in the heat of the day, siesta time, because she didn't want to be around anybody else. Her society had cancelled her, but Jesus challenged her lifestyle, and then restored her. And then it was in the end, she went back to her people and said, look, you need to come check this guy out. And then they themselves followed Jesus. And what I love about it is after they decided to follow Jesus, they are still described as the Samaritans. They're not these nondescript people. Okay, they have decided to follow Jesus, and within their culture, within their skin okay, they become followers of Jesus. That's not been erased. And so that for me, again, across ethnic, religious, gender lines there, the woman's relationship choices, we see a clear case where Jesus didn't cancel people.
That's great. And I think it's a very universal message and timeless message as well. So going a bit more into that and delving deeper, what do you think the implications of, for instance, the story of Jesus meeting the woman at the well is for our society today?
Ooh. Particularly as I'm very much concerned about the idea of racial justice and diversity. I think for me, that end piece where you've got these people who decide to follow Jesus, and even though the conflict between the Jews and the Samaritans in that passage, we don't get any record of it being resolved, but they are still able to follow Jesus. And I think that is a real encouragement to me that and anyone else, who may not be part of majority culture, you don't have to stop being who you are, in terms of your cultural skin and your cultural heritage to follow Jesus. I think that's a really poignant thing to bear in mind, particularly in this cultural moment. Yeah.
I love that. And I think something that I read by C.S. Lewis says actually the fact that Christianity is permeated through so many cultures and times and differences just so it shows like authenticity of the Christian faith. And I absolutely love what you said about that. And so we've talked a lot about the cross and what that means for us in terms of cancel culture. But just to kind of clarify and to articulate this, could you give us a simple explanation of what the cross is, why we have redemption and forgiveness from that, just so everyone is on the same page?
Well, the cross, oh my goodness, is essentially God's solution to our brokenness. The fact that we don't get it right, that we on the one hand long for justice, but we can't meet our own standards of justice anyway, that brokenness that we mess up and then we're good and then we mess up. And so this idea that you can't do it on your own and you don't need to, God has taken that upon himself. And so through the cross, that tension of our heart can be met, and by accepting what Jesus has done and deciding to enter into relationship with him, you can be in right relationship with God, but also in right relationship with others as well.
I think that's a really wonderful reminder for all of us that we just need to kind of take a step back and look at ourselves and see what God has done for us. So we've established now that cancel culture is something that's kind of the antithesis to what the Christian message is about. So what does the gospel, if it offers anything, what does it offer? What does it tell us about how we should respond? What is an alternative to cancel culture? And the right way, I guess, to seek justice, because it is a good thing.
Yeah, and I think the gospel, the Christian message, gives us a way back, whereas cancel culture takes you to an end where you can't recover no matter what you do. If you apologize, the apology wasn't good enough. If you don't apologize, why haven't you apologized? Cancel culture, the gospel, the gospel gives you a way back. And actually, what I mentioned about the story of the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, Jesus challenged her, okay, and also restored her. And I think that's what the gospel does. It challenges me in my messed up state. It challenges me in the fact that I don't meet God's standards for justice or other standards for justice, but it also restores me. And I think one of the things that I see that makes the gospel, the Christian message, beautiful, and the example I gave of Frederick Douglass, he was formerly enslaved but then became an abolitionist through his Christian faith, that God is on the side of justice, and if justice is something that you're really passionate about, then he is fighting that with you. Do you know what I mean? He's not standing back saying, okay, you've decided to become a Christian, now just go to church. No, God is very much involved in the movement and in the push for justice, and has promised a day of ultimate justice.
So it's great now that you mentioned the ultimate justice. So what is God's way of delivering justice, and how do we know that despite all the injustices and the suffering, the great suffering of this world, that we can be reassured because Jesus and God, Jesus will ultimately deliver a judgment, and to provide justice that we are so we just want from the bottom of our hearts.
I think that phrase you said, we want justice from the bottom of our hearts. And so if the world, if God doesn't exist, if we live in a universe without God, which at the root there is a nothingness to it, then where does our sense of something come from? Does our longing for justice actually point us to the righteous judge, the ultimate judge? How do I make sense of my outrage if at the root of the university there is rootlessness, there is a nothingness? And so I think that the very longing, as I said, the core of our being points us to God, and we see God delivering justice through people, as I mentioned, abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, activists that are working, throughout the world doing different things, but also knowing that you may well be in a situation where you're suffering and you're going through an unjust situation, but actually in the person of Jesus Christ, the Christian message is that he lived and that he knows what it is like to suffer. He knows what it's like to lose somebody, to grieve. He knows what it's like to suffer pain. So there's this two thing, that there's this day of ultimate justice. This longing in my heart is pointing me to the reality of the day of ultimate justice, but also because of the person of Jesus, I have a God who knows what it is to suffer and is with me in the suffering. And I think that's really important. I'll just give you this example in brief. When my father passed away at age 68, so too soon as far as I'm concerned, and dealing with the injustice of that, I had this. It was before COVID, so we had a lot of people coming through the house, and this couple came through the house, and they were recently married, both, I think, widowers, but widows, a widow and a widower married. And the woman told us about how she lost her daughter just unexpectedly. The guy told us how he lost his wife. She'd been sick for years, his previous wife. So they both had these stories of losing people that were really close to them, and it was just unjust. Like, why? And but I will never forget those two. People sent me cards, text messages, flowers, but they came to my house and they sat with me and my family as we were grieving the death of my father, and telling me those stories and knowing that I wasn't alone in it. And I think that's what the life of Jesus offers, a God who is not so transcendent and so far removed from what we've experienced, but a God who is immanent, who has endured that. And so that helps me in my moments of suffering, that he knows what it's like.
Yeah, I think the fact that God sent his son, as Jesus, as in human form, to experience what we experience as humans just comes to further reinforce the point that you mentioned about him knowing what suffering is like. So when Jesus went to the cross, he was innocent, whereas we as human beings are inherently flawed and we're sinners. And so what is so countercultural and striking about the cross that we should be looking to it regardless of whether, for instance, when we're grieving or when we're experiencing injustice that we don't understand, that we should still be seeking this ultimate justice that God wants for us and not the way in which we want to seek justice?
Because the cross actually speaks of grace, undeserved favor or undeserved, good treatment. In that, as you said, Jesus lived a perfect life, and it shows us the ultimate love of God to say, look, you cannot bear this on your own. I'm going to take the punishment. I'm going to take the consequences for you. And so it's like, okay, that's for me is the ultimate sacrifice. Giving up yourself for somebody else, giving up what you have for somebody else is the ultimate sacrifice, and making it possible for me to be in right relationship with God.
And especially what you said about undeserved, I definitely really feel that and resonate with that as well, because as we've established multiple times today, we ourselves have done so much wrong. So I guess to wrap things kind of up, what would you say is a major takeaway in terms of how we should be responding now, instead of looking to cancel culture? We should look to forgive, and we should give grace. So what are some practical ways in which we can kind of carry that into our day-to-day lives? Because we most of us, and I guess some of us, know this in our minds, but when it comes down to it, the nitty-gritty, because of the feelings that we're so indulged and so deeply involved with, the practicalities and the realities of it it's so difficult. Mm-hmm. So how do we kind of reconcile the two?
Yeah, I think that it's important to note that the moral outrage that we feel, God feels that too. Okay, so owning, you know, your outrage, owning the fact that you want to see consequences to certain behaviors and actions, okay, that's okay to want to own that. But also having a measure of grace for people when they fall, because it is inevitable that you will fall to, maybe not in the same way or to the same degree, but holding together your anger, which is a good thing, but also a measure of grace practically. And so, you know, if someone is on, I don't know, social media apologizing for something, and I don't know, you go to the comments with your popcorn just to see what's being said, I don't know, maybe not being part of that kind of public, you know, denunciation of somebody, just kind of maybe diffusing situations, but not, as I said, not giving up the right response, which is to see consequences for such a person. And those consequences could be quite severe, okay? But not saying that a person is irredeemable. And I think that's really the key of what the gospel is, that you can come back, okay? Maybe not to the grandeur and the heights and the public space that you were in before, but you are not written off as a person.
That's really comforting to hear. So I guess for now, since it's 1:37, so we'll take a 5-minute break. You guys can go grab snacks, go to the washroom, and then again, the Slido is here, so please do submit questions and vote on the ones that you guys want Claire to answer, and then we'll get to them after 5 minutes. So let's say like 1:43. Yeah.
Okay.
Make sure that
Great. Okay, so you guys have submitted a lot of questions. We're just gonna try to get to as many of them as we can possibly get to. So the first question for you, Claire, why has Christianity so often found themselves on the wrong side of history? And some of the examples they raised were slavery, colonialism, feminism, LGBT rights, etc. How do you explain this?
I think that the first thing to say is that the church does need to own some of its past. It needs to own its past and have a posture of repentance about that. And I think that the root cause of that is that there are people behind it. And there are people that have used Christianity as a form of power for their own gains. So let's go back to the example of slavery. That's one of the examples in that question that was given. So in order to enslave, so many Africans, in order to enslave my ancestors, what needed to happen was the Bible, they created what you call the slave Bible, but they removed like a good 90% of what the Bible had in it and only kept passages to, keep people oppressed. Now, if you have to remove 90% of the Bible and give people this doctored version in order to oppress them, that's telling me that Christianity in and of itself is a liberating, the Christianity implies is a liberating thing, but actually Christians or people claiming to be Christians have distorted and used the Christian message for their own gain. And so at the end of the day, you've got people doing that. And also just to be aware as well, and two more points I'd say, very briefly, be aware as well, in terms of slavery and colonialism, all those sorts of things, you had a melting pot of things at work. So yes, toxic theology, which, as I mentioned, things like the slave Bible and such, was part of the whole transatlantic slave trade project. But in that you had science, phrenology, the shape of someone's brain, skulls being different. You had cartography, so the mapping of the world to make parts of the world seem less, seem smaller or have less of an effect, or contribution to the world at large. History, and philosophy as well. Some of the greatest philosophers of our time had some quite unsavory things to say about Black people in the past. So you've had this melting pot along with, as we have to own Christianity. And the final thing is as well to look at the record of what the church has done well. So we know that a lot of universities were started by the church. We know that hospitals were started by the church. We know that during the Roman Empire, there were Christians who used to take children who were flung on the side of the road, girls, predominantly girls, because they weren't welcomed. So yes, interrogate 100% the church's past, absolutely. And as I've said, my mission in terms of my organization really looks at that, but also where have we seen the fruit of Christianity in people's lives, and that being worked through the church as well. Great.
So leading on to the next question then, someone asked, why do you think we need Christianity to be able to forgive? Why can't we just forgive?
I think that the idea that you just forgive, I think I have some problems with it, because forgiveness requires, if I was to take your money, student, if I was to take your money and say, look, I'm really sorry, Mariam, but I can't afford to pay back to you, but can you forgive me? And you say, okay, you have paid the price almost twice because you've lost the money, and then now you're taking on board the inconvenience of never getting any compensation back for it. You have paid that price. You made a decision to forgive me, but it's still at a cost to you. So whenever an injustice is done to us or someone decides to forgive, it is at a cost to them. And so what the cross does is say, God is saying, look, it's a cost. It's a cost to you, my phone. It's a cost to me. God is saying, I've taken on that. So I do think this idea of just going, you're forgiven, is slightly problematic. The person who has, the victim is still taking on board and absolving what the perpetrator's done.
Sweet, that's very insightful, and definitely something we should reflect on, especially in light of eternity. I think what you said about just Jesus paying that cost, and through the restoration there is really, really comforting for so many of us. Next question. Someone said, there might be some parts of the Bible that might seem slightly misogynistic. The famous one is Ephesians 5:22-23. How do you address this?
Well, to try and untangle all the passages in the Bible concerning women, I think would be a day's conference at the very least. But just to say, that particular passage, and I think the word that gets under people's skin is that where it says, wives, submit to your husbands. And it talks about what the husband should do. What do we mean by submit? What does that mean? And that's actually caused some harm for people in their marriages when people have taken advantage of that. But I think it's important to look at the whole counsel of scripture, not just using one passage to oppress women. But in that particular passage, it says, wives, submit to your husband, but it also says husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. And we all know how Christ gave himself, right, on the cross. So we're talking about sacrificial love here. And so perhaps when we look at that holistically, it's about a balance that maybe a woman can trust a man who is giving a self-sacrificing love to her. And then so that passage, in light of others as well, in light of, because it's pointing to Jesus, in light of what Jesus has done, I think is looking at the whole counsel of scripture rather than kind of proof texting.
Great. This moves on to the next bit, which is about actually just racial justice and injustice. Someone said, since Christianity was used as a major tool to control Black people by justifying slavery, isn't leaving Christianity behind part of Black liberation?
Yeah, there are lots of people who would say that is the case. But what I'd like to do is to listen to the voices like Douglas, like Mary Prince, like Equiano. These are all people who've written slave narratives, for instance, who were able to separate how Christianity was wielded to oppress them and look at the person of Jesus Christ. So listening to their voices and finding that they were able to make a difference, make that distinction, and then also their faith empowered them to go on to liberation, I think is really a compelling thing for me.
Great. Okay, so let's move on to another one. This is more of a general question about today's topic. It's, should Christians support or be against cancel culture? What should our response be?
Oh my goodness. This is all about, I guess, degrees here. I think if you're talking to someone, if you're in a one-to-one conversation where someone is outraged at something that's happened, your reaction needs to be one where you affirm their anger, where you listen carefully and then try to support that person. But if we are wholesale, swathes and swathes of people are just disappearing from, public life because they've said, one thing in their past, which has, crept up through the archives of social media, for instance, and that the person hasn't shown a posture of being sorry, because I think, the whole, what is it, the sorry, not sorry apology, the sort of, I'm sorry if you felt that way, that doesn't cut it, does it? You want to see that the person's heart is being changed. If we can see that, then I think we should try to give people a second chance. But definitely there's something about the Christian message, the gospel, that affirms the anger, but also can redeem. And I think that is very hard to find in sort of the concentrated form of cancel culture.
I love what you said about how the Christian message and the cross reconciles two seemingly very opposite tensions, but really, actually, because of the cross, we have a God that affirms our anger, but also seeks justice for us. So this leads on to, I guess, the next question, also very much about justice. So you mentioned that, again, the Bible affirms the anger that we have. So someone asked, why is the motivation behind cancel culture correct? It seems like it's individuals participating in this culture have no skin in the game and do not bear the consequences.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, that's fine. Someone asked, why is the motivation behind cancel culture correct? Individuals participating in this culture have no skin in the game and do not bear consequences.
I think if we're talking about a sort of mob mentality, if you will, where people are just chiming in, and not because you can do things anonymously online, and sticking your opinion in, and destroying people's reputation and character, that's something that as a Christian, I don't think that I can be part of. But if I'm talking about the one-to-one, if I'm talking about a family who has, you know, been treated unfairly by someone in a position of power, then I'm going to have to make room for their pain and for their hurt. I think maybe social media caricatures some of the good intentions or some of the, as I said, that good moral outrage behind cancel culture.
Great. So again, next question. Someone asked, does Jesus cancel majority culture? So I guess this is what they're referring to as cultures that like the majority of people are involved in and like identify with.
I don't think Jesus cancels people, to be honest. I think he is countercultural. Okay, so Jesus kind of confronts us with a different way of living, a different way of doing life that is radically transformative. He himself is, you could say, anti-cancel culture. He's just anti or counter all our cultures. You know, he's come to present the kingdom of God, which is a wholly different thing. But I do think, again, going back to that example of the woman at the well, Jesus will challenge you. Jesus will challenge you in your life, your culture, your society, will also restore you. And I think that he doesn't cancel people.
Wonderful. Okay, let me see if there's another. Someone asked just now, when can cancel culture be just?
Again, it depends on what you mean by cancel culture. Sorry, if you mean that, you know, someone is finished and never to return indefinitely, you know, then you'd have to ask questions about that. But I do think when there has been, you know, egregious harm, when you've got people who misled others to, you know, a huge extent, then there needs to be severe consequences to their actions. Does it mean that they as a person are finished? I think that's the difference. But their actions, there needs to be a right response to that.
Great. Okay, so this is another one on a very, very similar note, which is someone asking whether didn't Jesus cancel other cultures, namely the Pharisees, Jewish life, etc.
Okay, so I think, again, there's a difference between cancel and challenge. I think Jesus challenged the religious elite of his time because there was so much hypocrisy in that, in what they were doing, in how they were treating other people, in how they were so self-righteous. So he gave a challenge to them, but using his own words, Jesus came to fulfill the law. He didn't come to abolish it. He didn't come to, you know, cancel Jewish culture of the time. He came to fulfill the law. And so I think that the challenge there, the fulfillment, is a very different thing to cancelling, writing people off, writing their beliefs off as well.
Great. Okay, I'm just trying to see if there's anything. Again, we've touched on this already, but just because someone asked, if church is the institution for Jesus and the one we should go to, why is the church so un-Christ-like?
Well, one of the answers to that question is because we're in it. If you are a Christian, I'm in the church, and that's why it's so unjust, because I'm a mess. I'm capable of doing good. I'm capable of treating people well, and equally, I can be terrible. And that is the human condition. That is our issue, which the God of the Bible has come to answer. He hasn't left us. He's come to help us in that situation. Yeah.
Okay, so final question, just so we're nearing to it, we're going to wrap things up. Given everything that we've talked about today, cancel culture, redemption, mercy, grace, judgment, sin, why should anyone believe that Christianity is even true at all? What is the evidence for it?
Oh my gosh. Wow. I think about, I said this at the start actually, that if Christianity is true, then you're looking at a cumulative case. I don't think there's going to be this one thing, aha, this means Christianity is true. I think if God is the Lord of creation, if he transcends the creation and he is above it and he has created the world and us, then we should be able to see traces of him in many different ways. So when I look at philosophy and ethics, when I look at, you know, my sense of morality and why I care about people who are suffering, does that make more sense in a world where he exists, or where he doesn't? When I'm looking at scientific inquiry and looking at the way the universe began, fine-tuning of the universe, when I'm looking at those sorts of things, does it make more sense that there is an intellect behind such a universe or not? When I'm looking at my own personal experience and the encounters that I felt that I had with God growing up in a Christian home, how does that make sense? When I look at history, the person of Jesus, the historicity of the Bible, so you're making a cumulative case for the truth of Christianity. And it might be that someone who has deep existential questions and wants to know about their purposes, that the idea that God created the world and created us in his own image is the one question for them that makes them see that Christianity is true. Or it could be the person who is the scientist who says, actually, all of my scientific inquiry, my research points me to a designer, points me to a God. So it could be, the ultimate answer could be for different people, but actually I think you're making a cumulative case.
That's wonderful. Okay, so as I said, this is the last question. So thank you so much, Claire, for agreeing to speak to us. I hope you guys enjoyed this event. So before we end this, just have a few housekeeping announcements. There is a form that's, I think, going to be displayed. So it's just a feedback form. There's no display, but we have a feedback form that will somehow, should we access it?
That's fine.
It's fine, okay, we'll leave that for now. So we have an event tomorrow with Ken. He is an ex-chairman of this investment bank, so please do come along. It's at the Marshall Building from 6:30 to 8 p.m. tomorrow. So please do come along if you're free. And then next, please. Yeah, so we also have a coffee morning and a CU stall. The coffee morning will be on Friday at the Faith Center, and then the CU stall, which will be happening tomorrow and Thursday, which is just outside the SU building. So again, there's free pastry, I believe. So free food, always an incentive. I think that's it for announcements. Thank you everyone so much for coming. And yeah, thank you, Claire, again, for agreeing to speak to us.
No, thank you so much for having me, guys.